A major Hall of Fame horse race trainer was banned from California's Santa Anita recently, just the latest in a series of actions that PETA has helped spearhead after 30 horses died at that racecourse. The latest and what it means to the future of horse racing in America. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, we hear the latest from the woman leading PETA's drive to end cruelty in horse racing in this country.
To see the way that they are treated as commodities in an industry so often is heartbreaking. And to know that as horse racing itself is on the way out of existence, that horses aren't going to suffer in the same way that they always have with new rules and regulations in place. It's as Ingrid Newkirk says, it's ending a teaspoon full of suffering in a sea of misery. But for those horses themselves, who aren't going to be drugged and who aren't going to be raced to their deaths, it's very important. So it's quite meaningful for me.
PETA Senior VP Guillermo talks about how Santa Anita is taking the cruelty to horses seriously. Last week, it banned Hall of Fame horse trainer Jerry Hollendorfer, who trained 4 of the 30 horses who have died at that track since December of last year. More on that, how PETA has spurred a district attorney's investigation and strong legislative action in California that ultimately could lead to the demise of horse racing. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you've just found us, welcome and keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. If you're going vegan, listen to how PETA works to make restaurant change less meaty. Go to episode 62. Need a vegan mentor? Listen to episode 25. And listen to how PETA saves millions of lives in laboratories every year, episode 23. There's also a link to a survey in our show notes if you're so inclined. We'd love to hear your feedback. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. The name in the news stories on horses you've seen quoted is Guillermo, the PETA Senior VP leading the charge to end cruelty in horse racing. Here's an update on what's being done and the incremental steps to end more than the cruelty in that so-called sport.
It's been quite a crazy and tragic year for horses so far. Since we talked last, there have been more deaths, and the district attorney's investigation continues. And as people who listened to the first podcast will remember, we had requested the district attorney to launch an investigation into the training and veterinary methods because we believed that those were part of what the problem is. Those were part of what was leading to the deaths of the horses. So the DA did that. That's the first time that's ever happened to our knowledge, and that is ongoing. And the racetrack enacted some very serious reforms with the support of the California Horse Racing Board and under a certain amount of pressure from PETA and our supporters to make some change and to stop the bloodbath.
All right, so let's take it one by one. The DA's investigation, that came about because PETA specifically pressured the district attorney there in Los Angeles to look into why all those horses were dying. And at this point, we have, what is the number that we're up to now?
It's at 30, and thank goodness the end of the spring meet was this last weekend, so there won't be any more, at least for a while, at Santa Anita.
And so how did the district attorney catch wind of this? I mean, at some point they were pressured. What was PETA's involvement in that?
When the horses started dying in such big numbers, this has happened before at other tracks. It happens every day, tragically, at tracks all across the country. But when suddenly there seem to be more horses than usual, we become very suspicious that there must be something going on there beyond the regular cruelties of horse racing, which are bad enough. And when this happened at Del Mar, we went to the district attorney and said, here's what we know. 90% of horses who break bones on tracks and have to be euthanized, they find during the necropsy that they had a pre-existing injury at the site of that break. And somehow that injury was masked, and it was likely done with medication. So we asked the district attorney to investigate this as a criminal matter. We have not had luck with this before. The San Diego DA said, no, we'll leave it to the California Horse Racing Board. But this year, we not only sent a letter to the district attorney outlining our concerns and asking for this investigation, we had a big protest in front of the DA's office. We had about 50 people out there with signs. And on that very day, the DA decided that she would assign some investigators to the case. And she did that. And since then, the DA has also launched a task force to look into racing in California and to see what the issues are.
So now a lot of people might say, they might question, why is this a criminal matter? I mean, where's the criminality here?
Well, if trainers are knowingly misusing medication, and this is the kind of thing we uncovered in our investigation of trainer Steve Asmussen several years ago, and that the New York Times uncovered in its investigation in 2012 on horse racing deaths, if these trainers and veterinarians are misusing medications in order to keep horses who should be recuperating from injury on the track, then to us, that is cruelty to animals. It violates state anti-cruelty laws. And it goes then beyond a California Horse Racing Board matter, where they look at what the regulations are, and it goes into the statute on cruelty. And that's why. And I'm just so relieved and happy that the DA has said, all right, we're going to take this seriously. And I think that's in large part because Californians were so upset about what's going on. And that has a huge influence on the district attorney. And 50 people standing in front of your office saying investigate now is influential too.
And so the DA's looking into this. It's not just like a pro forma kind of thing. I mean, it's a serious criminal investigation.
That's right. And I think that's what's so important. For decades, horse racing has controlled itself like it's run the industry like an old boys club, like a private club. And whatever happened was within racing, and only the racing industry had the authority to do anything about it. Mostly what they did was nothing. And so this was obviously a problem when you have people saying, hey, these dead horses are our problem, not the public's. And this is the first time I think that I have seen to such a degree the public say, no, these horses are of concern to everybody. And to see the DA agree with that, I think is a very important move ahead in the fight to stop horse racing cruelty. And let me be really clear. PETA's opposed to horse racing. We're opposed to the use of animals in sports. But when these deaths became so public, we felt, as we have for the last decade that we have been working on this issue, that we had to do whatever we could to try to prevent the suffering and the deaths of these animals.
Well, the fact is, it would seem that with this investigation and with the things that PETA is doing, this is probably more, PETA has done more to end cruelty in horse racing than anyone else has in the history of horse racing, really, in America.
Well, we're certainly at a turning point. And what we've seen since the DA launched her investigation is a series of new rules that have been put in place in the state of California that now makes California the most progressive state for regulating horse racing. It's not a perfect industry by any means. There's a lot wrong with it. There's a lot of suffering that goes on. But they have banned a dozen medications that were being used to mask these injuries. They have so many levels of review now that when a horse has to be on the track for 48 hours, for example, before that horse is allowed to train on a track, because the veterinarians and the people who are working there and are in charge of these inspections need to see what the horse looks like. Does the horse show lameness or injury? And there is the layer of inspection that occurs right before the race and at the gate. And we have seen an unprecedented number of scratches. And scratches are the term that's used to refer to horses who are scheduled to run, but at the last minute they're pulled. And these are veterinary scratches, which means veterinarians are looking at these horses, even up to the point of going into the starting gate on the track and saying, no, this horse is not healthy enough to run. There was even one scratch when these new rules were put in place that in reading the notes, it said that the horse didn't want to run. And they didn't force the horse to run. And I think we've just never seen anything like this before. It's, like I say, not perfect, but it's so much better than it was. And California needs to embrace this throughout the state, and that's what we're seeing happening now.
It's hard to believe that some of these things, which seem pretty common sense, weren't done before. Is it possible that there could have been some collusion between veterinarians and the horse racing industry and trainers? Is that what they're looking at? Are they looking at, or was there just a kind of a tacit agreement to look the other way and not really go deeper into matters?
It has always been an easy fix. Not, as I say, the entire industry, not the cruelties of the whole industry, but to stop these breakdowns has always been something that could have been dealt with. We've been saying it for 10 years. We showed it on video in 2014, and we've been saying it ever since. You got to get rid of the drugs. You have to have the proper racing surface. It should be a synthetic track instead of a dirt track. You have to allow horses time to recuperate. There's so many simple steps that could have been taken in the last 30 years that just never were. And it took this moment when the public said, okay, no more. And the racing industry began to fear for its very survival. And that's what's brought about this change.
So the changes were instituted at the DA is still investigating. The California Horse Racing Board is making changes. Where does the legislature fit in? What's going to happen there?
Well, they've passed one law already just this week that gives the Horse Racing Board the authority to shut down a track if they need to. Now, we saw after 23 horses had died that we called for the suspension of racing at Santa Anita while they put new rules in place, and they did that. But the governor, Senator Feinstein, and PETA and others have called for suspension of racing since then, and they did not shut down the track. And this new law would give the Horse Racing Board the authority to shut it down. And PETA is working with an organization called Social Compassion in Legislation, and also with the owners of Santa Anita, the Stronach Group, and also with the California Horse Racing Board to enact even stronger rules that will put California not only the most progressive state in the country, but the most progressive jurisdiction in the world if all of these rules go through.
Now, the Stronach Group is the major owner of tracks in California. They own a track in the San Francisco Bay Area. They own Santa Anita being the major one, which has also had these fatalities, 30 fatalities. They don't own Del Mar, which is in San Diego, and they have a summer meet. And the other tracks in California are smaller, kind of summer racing fair type tracks. So the Stronach Group, though, is a major player, not just in California, but nationwide. They own tracks in Maryland. They own tracks in Florida. Two hot spots in racing. The other two might be New York and Kentucky, certainly. But when the Stronach Group is helping or is sort of working toward getting some reforms, what does that say to the racing industry? And what does that say to people who want to see the abolition of racing?
Well, I think the Stronach Group and the horse racing industry very much fears the abolition of horse racing. And that's why these changes are happening now when they have never happened before. But what it says to the industry is, well, we can no longer turn our backs. We can't ignore this problem anymore. And the Stronach Group is not only going to set about instituting these changes at their tracks in Florida and Maryland and elsewhere, but they are persuading other horse racing states, New York, Kentucky, Illinois, to do the same. And it's going to be very embarrassing for racetracks in other states if they don't embrace these rules. And as horses continue to die, how are they going to explain that when we have a leader in racing saying, here's how we can reduce the number of deaths, here's how we can get the deaths to zero, because, of course, that's the only acceptable outcome here.
And that leader in racing you're referring to is the head of the Stronach Group?
Belinda Stronach has decided that horse racing needs to change, that the way things have been done in the past are no longer acceptable. And it's been a painful way to learn that lesson for her. It's been loss of life for horses. So it's hard to feel sorry for anybody in racing. But she has decided that this is the moment for racing to change, and this is the moment for racing to begin doing everything right. So even those things that have not necessarily been implicated in the deaths of these horses, such as using a whip, although we don't know for certain what part that may have played, the move to ban the whip, the vote to ban the whip, which is now in rulemaking, is part of the process of acknowledging that the public does not wish to see horses beaten, and the public does not want to go to the racetrack and worry about a horse dying on the track. So it's a very important moment in racing.
And just last week, the Stronach Group did something really pretty unprecedented. They banned the Hall of Fame trainer Jerry Hollendorfer, who is based in San Francisco and also has horses at Santa Anita, where he does his so-called big-time, horse stable. But what is the significance of that? And why did they ban Hollendorfer? What does that mean?
It's so important. We have said for 10 years now, as long as you let these people continue in racing who break the rules and who harm horses by breaking the rules, there's no hope. There's no hope for the horses. And we have long advocated for getting rid of these people. Kick them out. Why don't you just kick them out? Why don't the horse racing boards revoke their licenses? Why don't the tracks bar them? So this move on the part of Santa Anita, on the part of the Stronach Group, is so important because Jerry Hollendorfer, he trained 4 of the horses. 4 of the 30 horses who have died at Santa Anita this year were trained by Jerry Hollendorfer. Another 2 of his horses died at Golden Gate Fields in Northern California. Another horse was injured so badly this year at Santa Anita that he had to be retired. And Mr. Hollendorfer has at least 16 medication violations. 16. At what point does somebody say enough? And I think there may have been other issues involved with Mr. Hollendorfer and the way that he was dealing with horses on the track, but I don't have that information specifically. It's a very serious move to ban a trainer because nobody ever does it. So for this finally to happen, it should be like the dam breaking, and every other track should get rid of these trainers that they know are part of the problem and not let them back on their tracks at all. But the New York Racing Association has welcomed him with open arms.
What does that mean? Or what does that say?
It says that they would like to continue their old boys club where they reward people for winning, even if it comes at the expense of the horses. And Mr. Hollendorfer is a Hall of Fame trainer, meaning he's been recognized for all the wins he's had, while everybody has looked the other way about the nasty side of his business.
Well, he has all those wins, but he also has those 16 drug violations on his record. Once again, for people listening, the idea of the drug violations are that these drugs aren't used to make the horses run faster. They're really just used to make the horses run. If they're lame or if they're not well, the allegation is that drugs are used to mask the pain so the horses run. Sort of like human beings, athletes getting, a cortisone shot or something like that, right? Something like that?
It's like that, except that there are regulations in human races. And of course, humans can choose whether or not they want to run. Horses don't have that luxury. I mean, the horses, from the moment that they're born in the horse racing industry, their lives are so unnatural in so many ways. And the one thing they don't get to do is decide when they get out of a stall and when they run. I think, with the argument that horses love to run and that's why racing is okay is so absurd, because they have no choice in their lives at all. And by the way, if they love to run, why are you hitting them to make them do it? So yeah, I think it's worth saying that the reason we focus so much on medication and why it's so significant that trainers have been sanctioned by state racing boards for medication rules, why that matters is that it is the drugs that is forcing horses to run when they shouldn't be. And a horse steps on a track, and by virtue of being a racehorse is medicated in today's racing industry. And this is so detrimental to their health.
Now, for people who are listening who are sports fans, you may have noticed that in the last few weeks, the NBA Finals were on, and the Golden State Warriors had two injured players. The top one being Kevin Durant, who's known as perhaps the greatest or the best basketball player in the world currently, and then there was Klay Thompson, who was also hurt for the Golden State Warriors. But Durant's injury kind of captivated everyone because his not playing, moved betting lines, and everyone was talking about it who was following the NBA Finals. And, Durant was told not to play. He then tried, and then he re-injured himself. And I think that people got a glimpse of an athlete, a human athlete, when faced with, well, do I run, do I not, or do I play, do I not play? He chose to play. He re-injured himself. But it was ultimately his choice, right? He wanted to do it.
Okay.
Now, horses, no one cares, right? They just shoot them up and send them out on the track. And I think that's the difference that people need to see, that, when it comes to human beings and human athletes, we give them some respect and say, look, he's a gamer, he tried, but look what happened. He re-injured himself. With horses, if they re-injure themselves, they die. They don't get better.
That's right. When horses are medicated and they're forced to run, they risk injury and death. And they also risk being so severely injured that they can never race again, but they're still alive. And at that point, they can be sold at auction, sent to Canada or Mexico for slaughter. We've done investigations on this. You can Google PETA and horse racing and slaughter investigations and see what we found, which is incredibly disturbing. And frankly, just immoral and wrong. But some of the horses that we rescued weren't even very old. I'm thinking of one who was just 5 years old. We rescued right off the track. And he, at the age of 5, the year that the horse's bones become fully mature and fully hardened, this horse was so arthritic that it wasn't safe for his own health for anybody ever to get on his back. Not that we would advocate that. But even a child riding this horse would have been too much for him to endure because his joints were so broken down. And part of the reason those joints break down is the medications that they use on them.
We talked about the trainers and we talked about the vets. How about the owners? I mean, the owners have to have some responsibility here too. I mean, it's their horses. The trainers don't own most of the horses that they train. And a lot of trainers, I'm sure, would say, well, I'm racing these horses because if they don't race, they don't earn. And if they don't earn, owners are, they don't want to pay fees. They don't want to pay feed bills. They don't want to pay vet bills. So it becomes this business where the horses must run because it's the only way they earn money. And to earn money is sort of the ultimate goal, because otherwise you just have the horses as this drain on the owner's purse. So what is the responsibility on the part of the owners?
I'm told by the many people in the racing industry who call and report these things that there are some owners that put tremendous pressure on the trainers to run horses, even when they shouldn't be. And basically it's what you said. If that horse is not running, that horse is not earning. But it seems to go beyond that. It seems to be some owners just like to know, well, I've got this horse. I don't want this horse resting. I want this horse racing. And there's a lot of that involved, I think. And we've heard of some very prominent cases where prominent owners have insisted horses with bad feet, for example, be run. to the detriment of the horse and of the horse's health. So they certainly do play a role. If they stood back, though, and took the long view, I think they might realize that they're probably paying $300 or $400 or $500 a month in medication bills that they shouldn't have to be paying, because the horses shouldn't be medicated. They need to be allowed the time to recuperate, and they need only to race. They should only be raced when they're well enough to race.
Yeah, but my point is the people who keep this thing going, I mean, the trainers and the vets and the California Horse Racing Board, well, they're cracking down a little bit more now, but they're enabled by the owners with their money who say, this is my dream, this is my hobby, and we're going to make this horse run because we're going to have a Kentucky Derby winner this year. And then, they don't. They have a $10,000 claimer that they abuse, and they just keep running on the track. I mean, it just seems like the owners have to take a little bit more responsibility than I've seen in any of the stories and any of the headlines in the last 6 months.
Well, certainly the owners should get behind the new regulations and the new reforms and stop fighting them. Invariably, when somebody in racing wants to make things better for the horses, what happens is the owners and the trainers push back. Now, we're seeing so much less of that in California now because it's been such a scandal. And I think we should look at the big picture in California, too. We talk about 30 horses. This is business as usual. And I think it's so important to realize that 200 horses a year die in California alone. And only 2 states are really transparent about how many horses die, and that's New York and California. And a lot of the states, we really have no idea because they keep it secret. So it's very difficult to know exactly how many horses are dying. And it's important that everybody in every part of racing, from the owners to the trainers to the people who are in charge to the track owners, all get on the same page with this and stop trying to weather a bad public relations scandal and do something that's going to help the horses.
Yeah, because, this thing about horse deaths, they've always been there. They've always kept it under a shroud in the racing industry, and it has never come out in the same way as it has in the last 6 months, because just the number within the last 6 months seems to be more than it ever has. But as you point out, horses die routinely at the track, and it's never been made a big deal. But when 30 horses die,
well, what I think it is isn't so much the number, although the number is certainly shocking and appalling. What I think it is the public has changed. I mean, I know that I have been saying the same thing for many years now. And when we did all of our 7 investigations into horse racing, our video investigations into horse racing, all of them caused a small scandal at the time. There were newspaper articles, and especially the investigation of Steve Asmussen, the trainer. There was so much media coverage for a very short period of time. Federal legislation was introduced. There was all kinds of talk about reform. And then, as the racing industry has always done, it waited for it all to go away. What's different this time is that it didn't go away. And I think it has less to do with the actual numbers than the fact that the public suddenly became aware of it and decided it wasn't to be tolerated anymore.
So this wave that started in California, they banned a Hall of Fame trainer. They've changed some rules. There's stuff going on with the DA in LA where Santa Anita is based. There's stuff happening in the legislature. But now New York and other states, New York has as you pointed out, they've embraced the banned trainer, Jerry Hollendorfer. What is the prospect of states like New York adopting the kind of rules that California seems to be on the road to adopting?
Well, I just have one thing to say to the other states. If you don't adopt these rules, then you can say goodbye to horse racing in your state, because ultimately that's where it's heading. The horse racing industry has been shrinking for a long time. There are half the number of thoroughbred foals born every year, or born now and every year in the last several years, than there were 10 or 15 years ago. So it's already shrinking. And now we have a public that is completely aware and intolerant of the death. So I think they better remain panicked and get busy and make things better for the horses. I think ultimately it's going to be very hard for horse racing to survive anyway. And for the horses, that's a very good thing.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Senior VP. Go to PETA.org and read more about what PETA is doing to end the cruelty of horse racing. Now, Kathy just celebrated her 30th year at PETA, which is still not as long as the time we've been married. During that time, she's done much for the animals. She wrote the book on the Silver Spring Monkeys case, the case that spawned the animal rights movement. She also led the changes in animal testing for cosmetics, just to name two things. I asked her to talk about the significance of the work that she's doing now on behalf of horses.
I am so fortunate to have worked at PETA for so many years. I feel like I should be the one that honors the organization because I work with such an incredible group of people who every single day talk about how we can abolish the worst forms of abuse that make so many animals' lives and deaths absolutely miserable. So it's a great honor for me to be an employee at PETA. And I have spent most of those 30 years working to get animals out of laboratories. And we've had some incredible successes, and those are important to me. And this one, horse racing, is very close to my heart because I have such incredible respect for horses. I do for all animals, but there's something about horses that I find so moving. And to see the way that they are treated as commodities in an industry so often is heartbreaking. And to know that as horse racing itself is on the way out of existence, that horses aren't going to suffer in the same way that they always have with new rules and regulations in place. It's as Ingrid Newkirk says, it's ending a teaspoon full of suffering in a sea of misery. But for those horses themselves, who aren't going to be drugged and who aren't going to be raced to their deaths, it's very important. So it's quite meaningful for me.
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Senior VP. Once again, leading the charge to end cruelty in horse racing. Go to PETA.org for more. And that's our program. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on ALDEF.org, that's AALDEF.org/blog, or at amok.com, AMOK.com. Incidentally, coming July 20th through 28th in Washington, D.C. later this summer, my one-man show, Amok Monologues, a comedy on race, ethnicity, Harvard, NPR. Come see it. A little animal rights scene here and there. It's at the Capitol Fringe July 20th and 28th. For ticket links, go to amok.com. Once again, thanks for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.